Our Assistant Town Administrator, Outreach Coordinator, and I'm Julie Secord, the Director of the Council on Aging. Very pleased to introduce our author and today's speaker, Dr. Edward Hoffer.
Thank you very much, and sorry for all the technical difficulties. First time it's happened, but at least it was fixed. Time gives one a certain perspective on a number of things, and having moved on to another career, I've decided to try to share with the world some of my perspective on problems in the American healthcare system. I have lived through a very interesting era. Scientifically, we have made enormous advances. I think many of you in the room have hair that's at least as gray as mine, and probably share with me memories of things like public swimming pools being closed because of polio epidemics. I know when I was an intern at Mass General Hospital, our treatment of somebody coming in with a heart attack was we put them to bed typically for 3 or 4 weeks and hope that they would get better. Nowadays, polio is essentially an extinct disease thanks to immunization. Somebody comes in promptly with a heart attack, you open up their artery, and they go home the next day. So we are doing an awful lot better in terms of our ability to treat people. And that's the good side. The bad side is the idea that the medical profession was a calling, that we were here to help people, seems to have somehow morphed into the fact that medicine is a business, and lots of people are making lots of money out of it. And I think that that is something that needs to change, and it needs to get public behind it. I think the time may be ripe that we can start to affect changes. We've got to do something. Back about 1960, most Western countries spent somewhere between 6 and 8% of their gross domestic product on health care. US was around 8%, some of the European countries closer to 6%. But that was what was sort of the norm. And in the period since then, I'm going to go forward and then we'll come back. This is a graph of the overall cost of living increase versus the medical. And not surprisingly, this is the overall consumer price index. So this is the medical price index. Starting 1960, 1970, 1980, they kind of paralleled each other, which would be normal. Their prices go up. You know, again, you don't expect to spend 50 cents a gallon for gasoline, and you don't expect to have a house call for $5. So prices go up. But what's happened since about 1980 is the consumer price index is now about 130% of what it was in 1960. The medical price index is about 400%. So there's just been a disconnect between what has happened to prices in general and what's happened to medical prices. Last year, for which we have good statistics, we spent $3.5 trillion on healthcare in this country, about almost $11,000 per person. And this is dramatically more than other Western democracies are spending. That most of them are spending about half of what we spend. And again, GDP used to be 6-7% in Europe. It's now gone up to about 10% in most of Western countries. In the US, it's 18%. So again, we are so far out of the norm that it's almost unbelievable how we got there. And one could say, well, gee, we've got the world's greatest health care. That's, we're spending more money, but, we live so much longer and we're healthier and it's really money well spent. Well, that is nonsense. The average life expectancy of an American child is 78.6, and in at least 29 other countries around the world, it's 80 or more. Japan is the leader at 83.7, most European countries 82, 83. So clearly, we are not getting great value for our dollar. Fascinating story, if anybody remembers it, about 5 or 6 years ago, Time magazine had a special health edition. And one of the stories they indicated was that a child born in Havana, Cuba, had a better chance of making it to age 2 than a child born in the United States. We have a lot more neonatal intensive care units, but we do not have better results. Maternal deaths. You know, a healthy woman having a child shouldn't die. It does happen. Inevitably, there are going to be problems. But if you look at maternal death rates per 100,000 live births, most of the world is 6, 7, 8, United States 26. And most of the world, that number is getting better. In the United States, it's actually getting worse. So, you know, where is the value for our excess spending? The one area where the United States is a world leader is impoverishing people through medical expenses. You know, again, the last year for which we have good numbers, 20% of Americans had at least one medical debt collection on their credit report. About half of all credit report dings are for medical expenses. And, you know, again, a significant portion of working adults say that they have had their credit rating lowered because of medical debts, which in turn means they pay more for mortgages, they pay more for auto loans, or they can't get them. And again, if you look around the country, or look around the world, this is essentially unheard of. You know, I have a number, I grew up in Canada, I have a number of friends there, and they have all had first-class medical care with us. One old schoolmate of mine who went into Montreal General, had a cervical disc operation, recovery, and he said his out-of-pocket expenses were his cab ride. So, Uwe Reinhardt, who was a health economist, wrote a very interesting paper for an academic journal, and the title of his paper was "It's the Prices, Stupid." We don't overuse medical care. Again, you could think, well, maybe Americans would just go to the doctor so darn often, that's why we spend so much money. We don't. Europeans see doctors about 50% more often than Americans do. They have roughly twice as many hospital beds, and they use them more. So, you know, they are Europeans who spend half what we do actually consume more medical care, not less. We're getting older, and as we get older, our medical expenses naturally go up, and that, you know, that's one reason why the numbers do go up everywhere. But in fact, our population over 65 is less than it is in countries like Japan, like Europe, where they spend much less money. Okay, prices. We had a good friend, we were in Nice, he got a terrible back pain, he was sure he had a disc, he walked into an imaging center, had a CAT scan of his back, and paid in euros the equivalent of $200. The average price in the US is $1,450, and if you're unlucky enough to be in Alaska, it can be well over $3,000. Same equipment, same everything except for the price. Yes,
Is that the list price or what the insurance companies actually pay?
that is what is paid on average. We had a friend who was in Paris, fell down some stairs, broke her hip, was taken into a hospital in Paris, had a new hip, and went back to their rented apartment, had physical therapists, visiting nurses. Her total bill for the entire care was the equivalent of $8,000. average price that a hospital in this country gets is over 4 times that. She came back, doctor said, well, yeah, it was a great job, we wouldn't have done it any differently here. So, again, one reason, and one very important reason why we do spend so much more than other countries is that about 25% of our so-called healthcare dollar does not go to anything that improves anybody's health. It goes to overhead, administrative overhead. About half of that is insurance companies, their costs, their profit, and about half of it is the cost to doctors and hospitals of sending in bills and going through various reviews. You compare the 15% that a commercial insurer takes versus Medicare, which is about 2%. And granted, there's a little fudge factor there. Medicare can piggyback on Social Security, and there's some of the back office costs are not, but still, 7 times as much just shows you where some of that money is going. 2 academic hospitals of roughly similar size, one in the US, Duke University, has 1,500 people in their billing department. Montreal General has 10, and that's primarily to deal with their out-of-country people. So about $50 billion is spent to move money from one pocket to another pocket. Hospitals get bigger and bigger. As they get bigger and bigger, they employ more and more administrators. The ultimate medical contact is a nurse and or a doctor with a patient. Having 17 vice presidents doesn't help that. And as hospitals get bigger, of course, you get more and more layers of administration, all well paid, all with their own support staffs, and all of this goes into the overhead that the hospital charges. If you've ever looked at your hospital bill, every time you get a Tylenol or an aspirin, you get a $5 ding on there. There was a fascinating little story in a newspaper. Somebody who went in, had a new hip put in, looked at his bill, saw that it was charged out at $26,000 and change, and he made a point of trying to find out from the manufacturer what the hospital paid for it. And it took him a lot of work and a lot of effort, but he did find out that it was $1,500. So, if you've got a place like Boston where you have multiple hospitals, all of which are the best in the world, that means that every one of them has to have every service. Even though for a great many complex procedures where you're much better off to have a smaller number of people doing it, they get better at it, and this has been shown time and again for almost every complicated procedure. It's better for patients to have a small number of centers doing it, but that would take away bragging rights. So everybody does suboptimal volumes. One thing that we're seeing more and more as the complexity of trying to deal with insurers gets to weigh on doctors, and everybody gets sick and tired of the fact that you've got 147 quality measures that you're supposed to check off, and that every insurer you deal with has a different form you have to fill out for the same thing. A lot of doctors are throwing in the towel and they're selling their practices to hospitals. And the most immediate impact of that behavior is that prices go up. That when a doctor's practice is taken over by a hospital, the charges for the identical services go up about 150%. One little example, you go into your cardiologist who's in private practice, and the price that's paid by the insurer to have an echocardiogram done is $800 on average. Doctor is now, giant hospital cardiology practice in the same office, same staff, same everything, except the name on the door has changed, and it's now $1,920 on average. So, And this, say 26% gone to 38, and I think the last figure I saw, we're approaching 50% of doctors are now hospital employees. And this trend is probably going to continue. Emergency department. For heaven's sakes, if you have a nasty cold and you can't be seen in your doctor's office in what you think is a prompt enough time, go to an urgent care center, go to a minute clinic or something. These are the prices. I think about 2 years ago and last year for low acuity conditions. These are things that even the emergency department can't have the justification to charge more than a sort of basic level visit. And you can see that what the comparable prices. This is an urgent care, this is sort of an in-pharmacy minute clinic type, and this is emergency room. So this is what you're gonna get charged. And if you happen to have insurance that looks at these things, they may say, that didn't need an emergency room visit, we're not paying it. So you're now on the hook for $1,500, $1,600 for your cold. Most of the world, the backbone of the medical care system is the general practitioner or the primary care physician. They take care of the vast bulk of things. Specialists tend to be hospital-based, tend to see the more obscure cases. The exact opposite in this country. We have very few primary care physicians, medical students coming out now, read the handwriting on the wall. They know that they can work better hours and make more money if they go into a specialty. And since a lot of them are coming out of medical school with $250,000 of debt, you can be darn sure that that is appealing to them. The specialist, the old saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And if you are good at doing something and you're well paid for doing something, you're going to do a lot of it. You go into your family doctor with heartburn, uncomplicated, you'll get some prescription for some medication, and in a month you'll feel better. You go into a gastroenterologist with the same complaint, you'll have him do an endoscopy, put a tube down your throat, say, yep, you've got heartburn, give you the same prescription, a month later you'll be better. So another big issue in this country, which is really almost unique, is our incredibly expensive malpractice system. If you look at what malpractice insurance, if you compare a family practitioner in the US to one in Canada, it's a sixfold the amount of money that it costs. And if in OBGYN, where it's sort of routine, you know you're going to get sued once or twice a year no matter what, it can be up to $68,000 a year. Is it good for doctors? Obviously no. Is it good for patients? Not really, because a huge amount of the money that comes out goes to lawyers, goes to expenses. I was an expert witness on a case about a year ago, and they took my deposition in downtown Boston. They all flew here from Indianapolis. There were in the room, along with me, a transcriptionist and 6 lawyers, all of whom had flown, stayed overnight, and were going to go back. And all of that came out of the money that the settlement was going to give. The other downside of it, since it is such an expensive process, is if you have a relatively low payout problem, the lawyer won't even bother. If you're not looking at a $500,000 plus suit that they get their third of, they won't even do it, no matter how flagrant the malpractice is. From a patient's perspective, it encourages much too much testing. The cover your rear. If I don't do a test, I may get sued. If I do twice as many tests, I'm less likely to, so do the test. you'd like to think that people would learn from their mistakes, and everybody makes mistakes. The best doctor in the entire world makes mistakes. If you're good, you learn from it, you don't make that same mistake again, and you try to teach other people so they don't make that mistake. But if you know that the upshot of honesty is you're gonna get sued, it's much easier to hide it under the table and hope nobody notices and nobody learns. I could spend an hour talking about our pharmaceutical industry. I won't. But again, if you look at what we spend compared to what the rest of the world spends, it is truly sad, frightening, makes one angry. We're spending 2 to 3 times the amount of any other country on prescription medications. Average wholesale price for some randomly selected medications, US and Canada, again, you can see 3 to 4 times for the exact same product. And I could have picked, you can pick any medication you like, the numbers are gonna look the same. They like to tell you they're in it for patient good. That's nonsense. They're in it for the bottom line. We've had, several, the one on the top, I don't know if Martin Skegley rings any bells to anyone. He was sort of the poster child for greed. They bought out the prescription for a medication that's not used that often, but is the only one that will cure a given disease, and they raised the price from $13.50 to $750. He was called in front of Congress, he was castigated, but nothing ever happened, the price didn't come down. And I recently saw a startup pharma executive who said, well, Martin Skegley was doing the right thing, his responsibility is to his shareholders. So think of that next time you hear them pontificating. One that hits closer to home because it's for a common disease is treatment of gout. And colchicine is a drug that has been used since the time of the ancient Greeks. They knew it worked for gout. It did 3,000 years ago. It still does. And colchicine was grandfathered in when the FDA came into business. An old drug. It's like aspirin. Never had to prove itself the way new drugs do. But there was a little fill-up, a little gimmick that the FDA put in there. They said if somebody is willing to take a look at some of these old drugs and do the testing and prove they work, we'll give them an exclusive. Well, somebody said, colchicine, that won't be hard to prove, and it wasn't. They did a study and they showed that, my God, colchicine is good for gout, a shock. So what used to cost $0.25 a pill now runs about $6 a pill. So you can blame the FDA for that one. Not satisfied with charging large sums of money, they want us to use more and more of their medications. And the wonderful ads that you see on TV, and they all kind of fit into a wonderful stereotypic, you start off with a gloomy person, typically the picture is black and white, and they feel awful, and they're moping, and they can't play with their grandchildren, and then they get the magic pill, and the screen goes like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz to bright colors, and they're happy, and they're playing with their grandchildren, and then you get this run-on of all the millions of side effects, but people assume, and it seems to work, that they're going to focus on the bright colors and ignore that. You know as well as I do, there is no free lunch. And the detail person, i.e. drug salesman who comes to the doctor's office bringing lunch for the staff, does not do so because you're best buddies. They do it because there is ample scientific data to show that even though doctors claim they can't be bought by a free lunch, and they may even believe that themselves, they are. that people have looked at numbers of visits, numbers of lunches, and prescriptions written for the product, and they go up pretty much linearly. If you have a number of lunches and this nice detail rep, you're just favorably inclined and you write more prescriptions. Even more pernicious in my viewpoint is that the opinion leaders, the thought leaders in medicine, the professors who give lectures at meetings, who write guidelines, are almost to a person in the pockets of Big Pharma. They are, if you are paid $5,000 plus expenses to go to a meeting and give a lecture, I don't think you're gonna badmouth the product, do you? Or if your laboratory is getting 70–80% of its funding from a company. And these are the people who, again, are sort of leading the way in terms of what's standard of care. A practical take-home for everybody is expiration dates. If you look at your prescription bottle or your over-the-counter medicine bottle, it'll say do not use after certain date. Ignore it. Medicines are good typically, unless they're exposed to extreme conditions, for years after that date. The U.S. Army, which wanted to know what would happen, in case of a catastrophe, did a little experiment. They took a bunch of pills, they buried them in the desert, they dug them up 5 years later, and they were all good. Recently, a pharmacy college in this country duplicated it and got the same results. So unless the pill is crumbling or smells bad, it's still good. Don't waste it, don't throw it out. Though, again, millions and millions of dollars of pills are thrown out for no good reason. I hate to be the one to bring this news to you, but there is no Santa Claus, and none of us are here forever. So, the issue is not, are we going to die? The issue is how we're going to die. And there is an increasing disconnect between what most people say and what actually happens. There's just too many, and I've seen too often over the years, people who everybody knew were, going to die in the next little while, stuck in an ICU with tubes in every part of their body, miserable, and not allowed to go home and be comfortable. Yeah, I mean, if we think we can cure you, if we have even a reasonable hope we can cure you, for heaven's sakes, we'll do everything. But when we know, and doctors are pretty good at knowing, that this is inevitable, focus on comfort. A very interesting fact which I found when I was researching the book is that in two totally different conditions, people with metastatic cancer and people with very severe end-stage heart failure who are entered into hospice programs not only are more comfortable, but they actually live a little bit longer. When you take away the sort of whipping somebody to try to get the last day that you can, you actually do better.
Dr. Hoffer,
Yes.
in your book you mentioned a person of 122 recently passing away, and I think a footnote on that was, I believe it was a woman.
Yes.
She was only 99 because she
But she lied?
She assumed the identity of her mother when her mother passed away so that she wouldn't have to pay taxes.
Oh, marvelous. Okay. All right. Most of us try to get away with being a little younger, but that sounds like a great something that is a huge problem all around the world, and we're not immune from it, is the fact that diagnoses are often wrong. This has been a sort of under the table, when people think of medical error, they think of, taking out the wrong kidney or leaving a sponge in somebody, and these are the obvious ones, and this is where the patient safety movement is focused. But in the last few years, this has now come to the fore. The National Academy did a very wonderful large book looking at the problem, and they estimated that in any given contact, about 5% of the diagnoses are in error. In many cases, this is not a serious issue, because it's whatever you have is gonna go away on its own, but in many cases, it is serious. As shown, multiple times, multiple studies in multiple institutions have shown that about 10% of hospital deaths are caused in large part because the diagnosis was wrong. There can be a number of reasons for this. Somebody doesn't want to tell the truth to the doctor doesn't hear the murmur, x-ray is misread, which happened unfortunately in our own family, lab tests. I say, if somebody ever tells you, when you have a test done, no news is good news, do not accept that. No news is usually good news, but no news sometimes means the lab test never came back. Lab test got put in the wrong file. So you always want to close the loop. You always want to have this is what your test showed. But again, the commonest cause of misdiagnosis is the doctor never thought of it. That there is a strong tendency of people to leap to a diagnosis early, focus on that, look for things that support it, and ignore things that don't. So, again, a problem, and one that, again, you need to, particularly if you get a serious diagnosis, you want to question it, and second opinions are very definitely worthwhile. Again, not just the medical care system, but we all play a role in why our numbers aren't as good as they are in other countries. What we do has a huge impact. This was sort of brought dramatically to life by a study that was done in a very large number of people and reported out almost a year ago now. And they looked at healthy diet, not smoking, either not drinking or drinking in moderation, regular exercise, and keeping your weight down. And if you did all these things, you had less cancer, less heart disease, and you died later. 50-year-old woman who was scored 5 out of 5 lived 14 years longer than one who was a 0. For men, 12 years longer. If we had a prescription that did this, it would be selling at $1 million. So, and these are all free, and they don't have side effects. Again, could spend a lot of time, but won't. You all know the issue with the fact that in this country we are world leaders in school shootings. We have more school shootings than essentially the rest of the world put together. Opioid epidemic, huge problem. Automobiles, the numbers are actually improving until the last few years when they've started to get worse. Maybe it's because of distracted driving, texting, but again, things that could be done that aren't being done. Yes.
I was just wondering, are suicide rates included in that number?
Yes. Well, suicide rates.
I mean, it may be related to
they
the
are,
other issues, but.
Certainly a large number of deaths by gun are suicides. In fact, there are more suicides than homicides involving guns. And again, if you decide to commit suicide and you cut your wrist or you overdose on pills, there's a very good chance that you are going to be not going to die. And most of those people do not try again. If you do it that way, your success rate, unfortunately, is darn high, and you don't get a second chance. But yeah, I think of something like 47,000 deaths by gunshots a couple of years ago. 37 were suicide, and they had others.
Teenagers.
Yeah, and a lot of them teenagers. Well, suicides tend to peak young men and older men. There's less in the middle, but and men use guns a lot more. Women tend not to use guns, which is why male suicide if you will, success rates are a lot higher. My own bias, and as I say, I'm hardly a socialist. If if there was such a thing anymore, I would call myself a Rockefeller Republican. But I think if we have got to move to single payer. With all the hysteria, if you remember back when the Affordable Care Act was passed, I mean, this was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth and enormous amounts of political capital spent, and it really didn't change much. It did add some very useful things, and probably the most one is removing the insurer's ability to not cover pre-existing conditions. And that is a critically important feature, which I think more and more are starting to realize. Roughly 100 million Americans have something that insurers consider a pre-existing condition they won't cover. And if you put that into family context, it means it affects almost everybody. So that is very important. But what Obamacare didn't do was do anything to impact our dysfunctional system. It kept the private insurers in business, didn't do anything to lower prices, and so I think we've got to make a sea change. You can get rid of the probably 20% of the 25% that we spend on administration in one fell swoop. You can cut down on some of the absurd overpricing. And one of the reasons why the European countries spend a third of what we do on drugs is they have a central purchasing authority, and they say, show us what good this drug does, show us what it's, how many lives it's going to save, and we'll tell you what we think is a reasonable price for you to sell it at. And if you're coming in with what I call a Me Too drug, a drug that's just like all the others that are on the market, but it's in a prettier capsule and it's got better ads, you're going to have to sell it at the same price as these other ones. You can't charge more. So getting there obviously ain't going to be easy, but I think it's going to be easier now than it would have been 5 years ago, because I think people's consciousness has been raised of some of the problems that we've had. That was the number one issue in many people's minds in the 18 midterms, and I think we have got to start putting pressure on our elected officials. The people who are in favor of a single payer system, as you can see, has finally reached the majority. Doctors are definitely much more in favor. A survey done about 8 years ago showed that 40% of doctors were in favor of single payer and 60% were against. A survey done about a year and a half ago flipped those numbers. 60% of doctors are now in favor and 40% against. Because again, doctors are living with the same dysfunctional system that everybody else is. Terminology counts. You can see if you ask the essentially exact same question phrased differently, do you think Medicare for all is a good idea? 62% said yes. Do you think socialized medicine is a good idea? 44%. And you can be darn sure that there are going to be the people in favor of it are going to phrase it that way, and the people against it are going to phrase it that way. So you've got to be able to cut through the terminology and look at what's being done. Practical things, what can you do in the meantime? You can lower drug prices, a number of things you can do. Whenever your doctor writes a prescription, ask if there is a generic equivalent. Don't let them go with what the pretty detail girl told them was the latest and greatest, because in many cases there'll be an almost identical product that is available generically. Several of the big chains, I know Walmart has a huge list of things that they'll sell you $5 for a month's supply, $10 for 3 months supply. get that printed out, and if you're gonna be, and ask your doctor if one of the medicines on that list would do just as good a job as what you're currently doing. They say, don't throw out pills because they're a few weeks after their expiration date or even a year. Online behavior, we all know that we're gonna go online and look things up, and, I've had this, I've already diagnosed myself on the internet, I'm just here for another opinion. If you go on Google, you're gonna get a lot of things on the first page, which is where most of us stop, and many of those are there not because they're the best fit for your question, they're there because somebody either paid for better placement or got a consultant to tweak their web pages so they'd show up high. So don't start with Google. If you're gonna start anywhere, the National Institutes of Health, PubMed, has a wonderful site with just about anything you could possibly want to know, and it's all vetted and it's all non-commercial, and I would always start there. If you still have questions, go to a site run by something like Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic, which, yes, are a little bit biased in terms of their specialists, but have pretty good information. If you are simply elderly, and certainly if you are ill, have an advanced care directive. Not only have it in writing, but discuss it with your family. Don't get in the situation that I've been in times where somebody says, Doc, I'm comfortable, I want to go home and die, and 3 of the 4 kids are all in favor of that, and the 4th one flies in from Seattle and says, do everything, or I'm going to sue your pants off. And that's the one that gets listened to. So make sure your family are all on the same page with you on that one. And we even have time for a few questions. Sir?
PSA tests, which some of us pay attention to. And when I get an order every year, it never includes a PSA test. Then I call the doc's office, I say include it. And from what